Every day, invisible threads are being woven around your thoughts, your choices, your very sense of reality. You believe you're making decisions freely, but are you? The uncomfortable truth is that manipulation isn't just something that happens in toxic relationships or by con artists on the street. It's woven into the fabric of your daily existence, operating in the background of nearly every human interaction you experience. The scariest part? The best manipulation doesn't feel like manipulation at all. It feels like your own idea. It feels like logic. It feels like love, concern, or care. And by the time you realize what's happened, the manipulator has already reshaped your perception of reality itself. But here's what most people don't understand about manipulation. It only works when you don't see it coming. The moment you understand the mechanics, the invisible becomes visible, the spell breaks, and that's exactly what we're going to do here. Pull back the curtain on the psychological tricks that have been controlling human behavior since the beginning of civilization. Let me be direct with you. If you've ever felt that nagging sensation that something was off in a conversation, if you've ever agreed to something and later wondered why, if you've ever felt your reality being questioned until you doubted your own memory, you've been manipulated. And it's time to make sure it never happens again without your awareness. Manipulation operates on a fundamental principle, the exploitation of human psychology. Every human being has cognitive vulnerabilities, emotional triggers, and social needs that can be weaponized by someone who understands how the mind works. These aren't weaknesses in the traditional sense. They're features of human consciousness that evolved to help us survive and thrive in social groups. But in the hands of a manipulator, these same features become back doors into your decision-making process. Let's start with something most people completely miss: the foundation phase. Before a manipulator can control you, they need to map your psychological landscape. They need to understand what you value, what you fear, what you desire, and most importantly, what you're insecure about. This reconnaissance phase is so subtle that you'll mistake it for genuine interest, friendly conversation, or even intimacy. Watch how it works. A skilled manipulator will ask you seemingly innocent questions. They'll listen intently to your stories, not because they care about you, but because they're gathering intelligence. When you mention your relationship with your parents, they're noting your attachment style. When you talk about your career frustrations, they're cataloging your insecurities. When you share your dreams, they're identifying what levers to pull later. The critical detail you need to understand is this: manipulators are studying you the way a locksmith studies a lock. They're looking for the tumbler that will open you up. And most people are incredibly helpful in this process because we're social creatures who bond through vulnerability and sharing. We interpret interest as care, when sometimes it's calculation. Here's a practical tell. Notice who remembers tiny details about your life, but seems to have selective memory when it comes to their own promises, commitments, or problematic behaviors. This asymmetry isn't accidental. They're building a database on you while keeping themselves opaque. Information is power in any relationship, and manipulators hoard power by collecting your information while revealing little of substance about themselves. Now, once they've mapped your psychology, manipulators move into the second phase, establishing authority and trust. This is where it gets psychologically fascinating, because they're not just trying to make you like them, they're trying to position themselves as a source of truth in your life. There's a manipulation technique so effective, it's been studied in cults, abusive relationships, and authoritarian regimes. It's called reality distortion, and it works by making you doubt your own perceptions while positioning the manipulator as the interpreter of what's real. They'll start small. You remember a conversation one way, they remember it differently. Instead of agreeing to disagree, they'll insist their version is correct with such confidence that you start to question yourself. This is the seed of gaslighting, but it's more nuanced than most people realize. The manipulator isn't just denying your reality, they're replacing it with their own piece by piece, until you stop trusting your own mind and start outsourcing your sense of reality to them. Once this happens, they don't need to control your actions directly. They control your perception, which means they control everything. Here's how you detect it before it takes root. Pay attention to how you feel after interactions with certain people. Manipulation leaves a signature feeling, a kind of cognitive dissonance, where your gut tells you something is wrong, but you can't quite articulate what. Your body often knows you're being manipulated before your conscious mind catches up. That confused, slightly anxious, off-balance feeling, that's your nervous system detecting a threat your rational mind hasn't processed yet. The next layer of manipulation involves something psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, and it's devastatingly effective. This is the psychological principle behind gambling addiction, and manipulators use it to keep you hooked on their approval. They'll be warm and affirming sometimes, cold and critical other times, with no predictable pattern. This randomness creates an addiction-like response in your brain because you're constantly trying to figure out what you did right or wrong to get the positive response. Think about it. If someone is consistently terrible, you leave. If someone is consistently wonderful, you feel secure. But if someone is unpredictably both, sometimes amazing, sometimes awful, your brain becomes obsessed with solving the puzzle. You'll work harder for their approval than you ever would for someone who consistently values you. This is why people stay in toxic relationships, working themselves to exhaustion to get back to those magical good days that feel so good precisely because they're contrasted with the bad ones. The detection method here is pattern recognition. Start documenting interactions with people who leave you feeling this way. Write down when they were supportive versus critical, generous versus withholding, available versus distant. If there's no rhyme or reason to it, if you can't predict their behavior based on your actions, you're being intermittently reinforced. And that means you're being controlled through one of the most powerful manipulation tactics ever discovered. Let's go deeper into the linguistic dimension of manipulation, because this is where it gets truly sophisticated. Manipulators are masters of language distortion. They use words as precision tools to reshape your thinking without you noticing the surgery being performed on your consciousness. One of the most powerful techniques is called semantic infiltration. The manipulator slowly changes the meaning of words in your relationship until you're speaking different languages without realizing it. For example, in a healthy relationship, trust means mutual reliability and honesty. In the manipulator's vocabulary, trust means blind acceptance of whatever they say without question. When they accuse you of not trusting them, they're not talking about trust as you understand it. They're demanding unquestioning obedience, but using a word that sounds reasonable. Watch for language that sounds emotionally charged, but is definitionally vague. Words like respect, loyalty, support, and love are favorites of manipulators because they mean different things to different people. The manipulator will use your definition to draw you in, then gradually enforce their definition to control you. By the time you realize being supportive in their language actually means never disagreeing with me about anything, you're already deep in the relationship and questioning whether you're the problem. Here's another linguistic red flag: absolute language. Manipulators love words like always, never, everyone, and no one. These words don't allow for nuance, context, or complexity. They create a binary reality where the manipulator is completely right and you're completely wrong. You always do this. You never listen. Everyone thinks you're difficult. These statements aren't meant to be accurate. They're meant to be overwhelming. They're designed to make you feel so wrong, so isolated, so consistently problematic that you stop trusting your own judgment and start deferring to theirs. The countermove is precision language. When someone makes an absolute statement, ask for specifics. Always. Can you give me 3 examples from the last month? Watch what happens. Either they can't provide examples, which exposes the manipulation, or they provide examples that, when examined, don't actually support their absolute claim. The manipulation relies on you accepting the emotional weight of the statement without examining its factual basis. Now, we need to talk about guilt and obligation, because these are the currencies of manipulation. A manipulator will make you feel indebted to them, responsible for their emotions, and guilty for having boundaries. This creates a psychological dynamic where you're constantly trying to pay off a debt that mysteriously never decreases, no matter how much you sacrifice. Here's how it operates. The manipulator will do unrequested favors, make themselves indispensable, or frame their basic human decency as extraordinary sacrifice. Then they'll collect on these investments later, often with interest. After everything I've done for you, you won't do this one thing for me. The guilt this triggers is intentional and strategic. They're creating an emotional ledger where you're always in the red, always owing, always obligated. But here's the psychological insight that breaks this control. Actual generosity doesn't create debt. Real kindness doesn't come with strings attached that become visible only when you try to walk away. If someone is keeping score of everything they've done for you and using it as leverage, they weren't being generous, they were making investments they planned to cash in all along. The detection mechanism: notice who makes you feel guilty for having needs, preferences, or boundaries that differ from theirs. Notice who frames your autonomy as betrayal. Notice who treats your no as a moral failing rather than a simple boundary. These are people using guilt as a control mechanism, and guilt is only an effective control mechanism when you accept that their discomfort with your boundaries is more important than your right to have those boundaries. Let's examine another manipulation strategy that's become epidemic in modern communication: the false dilemma. Manipulators are experts at presenting you with 2 options, both of which serve their agenda, while hiding the existence of 3rd, 4th, and 5th options that would actually serve you. Either you trust me completely, or you don't trust me at all. Either you're with me, or you're against me. Either you do this, or our relationship is over. This binary framing is psychological coercion disguised as logical argument. It artificially narrows your reality to 2 choices, making you feel trapped into selecting the option that's slightly less terrible, when in reality, you should be rejecting the premise entirely. The manipulation isn't in the choice, it's in the framework that presents only these choices as possible. The sophisticated version of this involves the manipulator framing themselves as the only alternative to something you genuinely fear. You could leave me and be alone forever, or you could accept that relationships require compromise. They're positioning themselves as the barrier between you and your fear, making themselves seem necessary for your safety or happiness. But they're also the ones who spent months or years making you believe that your fear is inevitable without them. How do you counter this? Whenever you're presented with an either-or choice, ask yourself, who benefits from these being presented as the only 2 options? What other options exist that aren't being mentioned? And crucially, what would happen if I rejected this framework entirely instead of choosing within it? The manipulator's power evaporates the moment you realize you're not actually trapped in their binary. Now, we need to address one of the most insidious forms of manipulation: the weaponization of your own growth and healing. This is next-level psychological exploitation because it takes your desire to be a better person and turns it into a tool for control. You'll see this in people who constantly frame their abusive or unreasonable behavior as a test of your growth, maturity, or enlightenment. If you were really working on yourself, you wouldn't be so sensitive. A truly confident person wouldn't need reassurance. Someone who's genuinely evolved wouldn't have a problem with this. They're not actually interested in your growth. They're using the language of growth to make you accept mistreatment. They've figured out that if they can frame their harmful behavior as your healing opportunity, you'll not only tolerate it, but thank them for it. This manipulation is particularly effective on people who are genuinely committed to self-improvement, therapy, or spiritual development. These people have often done enough inner work to recognize their own patterns and blind spots, which makes them vulnerable to someone who weaponizes that self-awareness. The manipulator will point to your legitimate areas of growth and then claim that anything that bothers you about their behavior is actually your unhealed wound being triggered. Here's the critical distinction. Real growth feels expansive. It feels like you're becoming more yourself, more free, more capable. Manipulation disguised as growth feels contracting. It feels like you're becoming smaller, more doubtful, more dependent on the manipulator's interpretation of your reality. If someone's version of your growth looks like you having fewer boundaries, accepting more mistreatment, and doubting yourself more, that's not growth, that's grooming. The detection point is this: who decides what your growth looks like? If it's always the person who benefits from you being more accommodating to them, you're not being helped to grow, you're being conditioned to tolerate the intolerable. Real support for your growth helps you become more autonomous, more boundaried, and more confident in your own perceptions. Anything else is colonization, wearing the mask of care. Let's talk about isolation tactics. Because manipulators understand something crucial. You're much easier to control when you're separated from alternative perspectives. They need you in an echo chamber, where their voice is the loudest, ideally the only voice in your life. This isolation happens so gradually that by the time you notice you've been cut off from your support system, you're already dependent on the manipulator for your sense of reality. The tactics start subtly. They'll make small, critical comments about your friends and family. Did you notice how your sister always has to make everything about herself? Your friend seems kind of negative, don't you think? These seeds of doubt are planted casually, not as demands that you cut people off, but as observations that they're just sharing because they care about you. Over time, the criticism increases. Your relationships with others become sources of conflict in your relationship with the manipulator. They're hurt that you spent time with your friend instead of them. They're uncomfortable with how your family treats you. They don't feel safe when your coworker texts you. The message is clear without being explicit. Maintaining these relationships causes problems, while abandoning them creates peace. The most sophisticated manipulators will even seem to support your relationships while subtly sabotaging them. They'll encourage you to see your friend, then create a crisis right before you're supposed to meet. They'll be charming to your family, then complain privately about how exhausting it is to be around them, making you feel guilty for subjecting them to it. They'll say they want you to have other relationships, then become emotionally distant every time you exercise that freedom, training you to associate connection with others to loss of connection with them. Here's your detection system. Map your social network now versus a year ago. If it's shrunk significantly, and there's one person who's common to all the relationships that faded, that person is likely engineering your isolation. Notice if you've stopped sharing certain parts of your life with your friends because you're afraid they'll judge your relationship. Notice if you're making excuses for why you can't see people. Notice if the manipulator is somehow always at the center of every reason your other relationships are complicated. The reason isolation is so dangerous is that other people in your life serve as reality checks. They can see what you can't see when you're in the fog. They can say, "This isn't normal," when you've been conditioned to believe it is. Manipulators know this, which is why your increasing isolation isn't a side effect of their behavior, it's the goal. Now let's explore the manipulation tactic of manufactured dependency. This is where the manipulator systematically undermines your confidence, capability, and autonomy until you believe you can't function without them. It's psychological kidnapping. They make themselves your captor by convincing you that you're incapable of escape or survival without them. This operates through a process called learned helplessness, and it's heartbreaking to witness. The manipulator will volunteer to help you with tasks, then criticize how you do them until you stop trying. They'll offer to handle things for you, then point out how much you need them because you can't handle things yourself. They'll make decisions for you, then highlight how bad your judgment is when you try to make decisions independently. Let me handle this. You'll just mess it up. You're not good with money, so I'll manage our finances. You're too emotional to think clearly about this. Each statement is an assault on your sense of competence. Each intervention is presented as help but functions as evidence of your inadequacy. Over time, you internalize their assessment. You start to believe you really can't trust yourself, can't manage your life, can't make good decisions. The cruelty of this manipulation is that the manipulator is often the one creating the chaos they claim to be protecting you from. They manufacture crises, then position themselves as the solution. They create financial stress, then point to your inability to handle finances. They provoke your emotional reactions, then cite your emotionality as evidence you're irrational. You're being set up to fail, then blamed for failing. The way out of this starts with a radical act. Do something independently, no matter how small, and notice what actually happens. The manipulator has trained you to believe that your independent action leads to disaster. Test this hypothesis. Make a decision without consulting them. Handle a task they usually control. See if the catastrophe they predicted actually materializes. Most often, you'll discover you're more capable than you've been allowed to believe. The manipulator's authority over you was built on lies about your incompetence. Each successful independent action is evidence against their narrative and proof that the dependence they cultivated was artificial, not actual. Let's address emotional manipulation through crisis and drama. Some manipulators maintain control by keeping you in a constant state of emotional activation. There's always a crisis, always an emergency, always something that requires your immediate attention and emotional resources. This isn't accidental chaos, it's strategic overwhelm. When you're constantly responding to emergencies, you don't have bandwidth to think clearly about whether this relationship serves you. When you're in survival mode, you can't reflect on patterns. When you're emotionally exhausted from the latest drama, you don't have energy to enforce boundaries or plan an exit. The chaos is the control mechanism. Notice the pattern. Right when you start to get clarity, right when you start to feel stable, right when you start to pull away, suddenly there's a crisis. They have a breakdown. A family emergency, a health scare, a work disaster. And because you're a caring person, you rush in to help. The crisis consumes all your attention, and by the time it's resolved, your moment of clarity has passed. You're recommitted, re-engaged, and the cycle continues. This is manipulation through destabilization. The manipulator has learned that they lose control when you have peace, clarity, and stability, so they ensure you never have these things for long. They create turbulence to keep you off balance, because a person who's spinning can't find the exit. The detection method: track when crises occur. If there's a suspicious correlation between your attempts at independence or boundary setting and the emergence of emergencies that pull you back in, you're being manipulated. Real crises are random. Manufactured crises are strategic. The counter strategy is to maintain your boundary even during the crisis. This feels cruel, which is exactly why it's so hard to do. But if every time you try to create space, there's suddenly an emergency that demands you abandon your boundary, then you're training the manipulator that crises work. The only way to break this pattern is to hold your boundary and see what happens. Often, the crisis miraculously resolves itself once it's clear it won't function as a control mechanism. Now we need to dissect the manipulation of your perception through triangulation. This is where the manipulator introduces third parties, real or fabricated, to validate their perspective and make you feel like you're the crazy one for disagreeing. My therapist agrees with me that you're too controlling. Everyone at work thinks you're overreacting. My friends all say I should leave you because you're so difficult. The genius of this tactic is that it makes you feel outnumbered in your own life. It's no longer just you versus the manipulator, it's you versus the manipulator plus all these other people who supposedly agree with them. This creates massive self-doubt. Maybe you are wrong, maybe you are the problem. After all, it can't be that all these people are incorrect, right? Except, here's what you need to understand. You never actually hear from these people. You're receiving second-hand reports, filtered through the manipulator, about what others allegedly think of you. There's no way to verify any of it. And even when you do meet these people, they're often confused about what you're talking about, because they never said what the manipulator claimed. Triangulation serves multiple purposes. It isolates you by making you feel judged by a crowd. It validates the manipulator by surrounding them with supposed agreement. And it makes you stop trusting your own judgment, because surely all these people can't be wrong. The manipulator becomes the voice of the majority, and your dissent becomes the opinion of a problematic minority of one. The way to handle this is to insist on direct communication. If someone has a problem with you, they need to tell you directly. You don't accept second-hand reports about what others think. You don't allow the manipulator to be the spokesperson for how everyone else allegedly sees you. This destroys the triangulation, because it requires the manipulator to either produce these critics who will say to your face what they supposedly say behind your back, or reveal that everyone who agrees with them is fictional. Let's go deeper into the temporal dimension of manipulation, the rewriting of history. Manipulators are constantly editing the past to serve their present agenda. A fight you remember having, they claim never happened. Something they promised, they insist they never said. An event that occurred one way in reality is narrated completely differently in their retelling. This isn't simple lying. This is something more sinister. The manipulator is engaging in what's called memory warfare, a systematic assault on your confidence in your own recall. They're not just trying to win an argument about what happened. They're trying to make you doubt whether you can trust your own mind about anything. The goal is to establish themselves as the keeper of official history. Once you start deferring to their version of events because you're no longer sure of your own memory, they have complete control over your shared narrative. They can make themselves the perpetual victim and you the perpetual aggressor. They can erase their bad behavior and magnify yours. They can rewrite any event to serve their current emotional needs. This is why documentation is your weapon against this particular manipulation. Keep texts, keep emails, keep a journal where you record significant events and conversations. When someone tries to tell you something didn't happen the way you remember, and you can pull up the contemporary documentation that proves it did, their manipulation loses power. Your written record becomes external validation of your perceptions. But here's the psychological trap. Many people feel uncomfortable documenting their relationship because it feels distrustful or paranoid. The manipulator will reinforce this if they catch you doing it, claiming that you're the one with issues if you feel the need to keep records. Don't fall for this. The reason manipulators hate documentation is because it prevents them from rewriting reality. Your discomfort with keeping records is exactly what allows the manipulation to succeed. Now let's examine one of the most painful forms of manipulation: the withholding of basic humanity until you comply. This is where the manipulator uses their affection, attention, respect, or basic kindness as rewards for your obedience and withdraws them as punishment for your autonomy. You're being trained like an animal, except the stakes are your human need for connection and dignity. The mechanism works like this: when you do what they want, they're wonderful. They're affectionate, engaged, complimentary, fun to be around. But when you assert a boundary, disagree, or do something independently, they become cold, distant, critical, or cruel. The withdrawal is so painful that you learn to avoid behaviors that trigger it, even when those behaviors are healthy and necessary. This is different from someone being upset with you in a normal way. In a healthy relationship, someone might be hurt or disappointed, but they don't withdraw your fundamental humanity. They don't treat you as if you've ceased to exist or to deserve basic respect because you disagreed with them about something. The punishment doesn't fit the crime because the goal isn't to address a specific issue. The goal is to train you out of autonomous behavior entirely. The devastating part is that the manipulator will frame this as natural consequences. Of course, I don't want to be affectionate when you've hurt me. Why would I be nice to you when you've been so selfish? They make their withdrawal of basic humanity seem logical, like an understandable response to your bad behavior, when in reality, it's a calculated tool to keep you compliant. Here's how you know it's manipulation rather than genuine response. Notice if the withdrawal is proportionate and specific, or if it's total and vague. If you forgot to do something and they're irritated about that specific thing, that's normal. If you forgot to do something and they act like you're a terrible person who doesn't deserve love or respect, that's manipulation. The manipulator uses small infractions as excuses to justify massive retaliation because they're not actually responding to the infraction. They're using it as an opportunity to train you. The counter is to refuse to work for scraps of humanity. You deserve consistent respect, affection, and basic kindness, not because you've earned it through perfect behavior, but because you're a human being in a relationship. If someone's love and respect are so conditional that you're constantly walking on eggshells trying to keep them, you're not in a relationship, you're in an audition that never ends. Let's talk about projection, because manipulators are masters of accusing you of exactly what they're doing. They're cheating, so they constantly accuse you of infidelity. They're lying, so they claim you can't be trusted. They're manipulating, so they tell you you're manipulative. This projection serves multiple purposes. It deflects attention from their behavior, it keeps you defensive, and it confuses the reality of who's doing what to whom. The psychological mechanism here is fascinating. When the manipulator accuses you of their behavior, you naturally become focused on defending yourself against the false accusation. All your energy goes into proving you're not doing what they say you're doing. Meanwhile, their actual behavior, the behavior they've projected onto you, goes unexamined and unaddressed. It's a masterful misdirection. By accusing you of being the manipulator, the actual manipulator ensures that manipulation becomes the topic of discussion while positioning themselves as the victim of it. You're so busy defending your integrity that you don't have bandwidth to address their lack of it. Here's the tell. Notice what they accuse you of, especially if it seems to come out of nowhere or doesn't match your behavior at all. These accusations are often confessions. They're telling you what they're doing by claiming it's what you're doing. The specific accusation matters less than the pattern of projection. The way to handle projection is to flip the mirror. When they accuse you of something that doesn't fit your behavior, but might fit theirs, calmly ask them why that particular accusation is on their mind. Don't get trapped in defending yourself endlessly. Instead, get curious about why they're focused on this specific behavior. Often, the answer is that it's on their mind, because it's their behavior, and they're trying to preemptively manage your perception by framing you as the guilty party first. Now we need to address the manipulation of love and attachment. This is where it gets truly dark, because manipulators will study how you give and receive love, then mimic it perfectly in the beginning to create intense attachment, only to later use that attachment as a control mechanism. They're not loving you, they're love bombing you, which is a strategic investment in future control. In the beginning, it feels incredible. They seem to understand you completely. They meet your needs before you even express them. They're attentive, affectionate, and completely focused on you. It feels like you've finally found someone who gets you, who sees you, who loves you the way you've always wanted to be loved. But here's what's actually happening. They're studying you. Every detail you share about your past relationships, your insecurities, your dreams, your love language, they're cataloging it. They're learning what makes you feel loved so they can manufacture that feeling intensely and quickly. The goal is to create an addiction to the feeling they're producing in you, because once you're addicted, you'll do anything to keep getting that feeling, even tolerate their abuse. The manipulation kicks in when the intensity suddenly shifts. The person who couldn't get enough of you suddenly seems indifferent. The person who made you feel so loved suddenly makes you feel invisible. The withdrawal is agonizing because the high was so high, and you'll do anything to get back to those early days, which means you'll accept behavior you would never have tolerated from someone who hadn't first made you feel so extraordinarily loved. This is the trap. The love bombing wasn't love, it was setup. The real relationship is what comes after, but by then you're hooked on the memory of how it was in the beginning. You keep hoping that person will come back, not realizing that person was never real. That was a performance designed to create attachment that could later be exploited. The detection. If it feels too good too fast, if someone is moving at a pace that feels overwhelming, if you're hearing "I love you" and making big commitments before you've seen how this person handles conflict, disagreement, or stress, slow down. Real love builds over time through consistent behavior across varied circumstances. Manufactured love is intense, fast, and strategically deployed. Trust the process, not just the feeling. We need to discuss one of the most sophisticated manipulation tactics, the weaponization of your own values against you. A skilled manipulator will identify what you care most about: honesty, loyalty, family, fairness, kindness, and then frame their demands in the language of your values. They're not asking you to do what they want. They're asking you to be consistent with who you claim to be. "I thought you valued honesty, so why aren't you telling me your phone password? You always say family comes first, so why are you choosing your sister over me? If you really believe in forgiveness, you'd stop bringing up the past." They've taken your values and turned them into weapons that compel your compliance. The brilliance of this manipulation is that it makes you the hypocrite for resisting. You're not being asked to violate your boundaries. You're being asked to live up to your principles. Except the manipulator has redefined your principles to serve their agenda. Honesty doesn't mean surrendering all privacy. Family first doesn't mean accepting mistreatment from family. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting abuse or allowing it to continue. The manipulator knows that people who have strong values are often deeply committed to behavioral consistency. They don't want to be hypocrites. So if someone can convince you that your boundary violates your value, you'll often drop the boundary to maintain your self-concept as someone who lives their values. Here's the defense. Get clear on what your values actually mean. Write them down. Define them precisely. That way, when someone tries to redefine your values in service of their agenda, you have your own definition to reference. Honesty to you might mean being truthful in communication while maintaining appropriate privacy. When the manipulator claims honesty requires total transparency, you can recognize they're using your word, but not your definition. Let's explore the manipulation of appearing reasonable while being completely unreasonable. This is where the manipulator uses calm tone, logical-sounding arguments, and accusations of your emotionality to win conflicts while being fundamentally wrong. They're exploiting the cultural association between calm demeanor and correctness. Picture this: you're upset because they did something hurtful. You're expressing your feelings with emotion because you're hurt. They respond with exaggerated calm, speaking slowly and rationally, maybe even saying something like, "I can't have a productive conversation when you're being so emotional. Let's talk when you've calmed down." What just happened? They've shifted the entire focus from their harmful behavior to your emotional reaction to their harmful behavior. Your emotion becomes the problem, not the thing that caused the emotion. And they've positioned themselves as the rational adult trying to have a mature conversation while you're the hysterical child who can't control yourself. This is a manipulation tactic that exploits how we culturally devalue emotion and overvalue the appearance of rationality. But here's the truth: being calm doesn't make you right. Being emotional doesn't make you wrong. And someone who hurt you has no business tone policing your response to being hurt. The manipulator knows that if they can make the conversation about how you're communicating rather than what you're communicating, they never have to address their behavior. They'll nitpick your word choice, your tone, your volume, anything to avoid the actual issue. And many people fall for this because they've been socialized to believe that if they can just express themselves perfectly enough, they'll be heard. But you're not being unheard because of how you're speaking. You're being unheard because the manipulator doesn't want to hear you. The counter strategy: name what's happening. You're focusing on my tone to avoid addressing my concern. My concern is valid regardless of how emotionally I'm expressing it. Don't let the conversation get derailed into a debate about whether you have the right to be upset or whether you're expressing it correctly. The issue is the issue, not your reaction to the issue. Now let's examine the manipulation that happens through strategic incompetence. This is where someone pretends to be incapable of tasks so that you'll stop asking them to do those tasks and just handle everything yourself. They're not actually incompetent. They're strategically performing incompetence to avoid responsibility while maintaining plausible deniability. They'll do the dishes but leave them filthy, so you have to redo them. They'll do the laundry, but somehow everything comes out ruined. They'll watch the kids, but create such chaos that you're more stressed than if you'd just done it yourself from the beginning. The message is clear: asking them to contribute creates more work for you than just doing it yourself. This manipulation is insidious because it masquerades as helplessness rather than refusal. They're not saying no directly, they're just so bad at the task that you naturally stop asking. And they get to maintain the moral high ground because they tried, and you're the one choosing to do everything yourself. They've engineered a situation where you're doing all the work while they're blameless. The tell is consistency. If someone is genuinely struggling with a task, they get better with practice and feedback. If someone is strategically incompetent, they never improve no matter how many times they do it or how much guidance you provide. In fact, they might even get worse over time because you've shown them that poor performance results in being relieved of the responsibility. The solution requires calling it out directly. I notice that every time you do this task, it's done so poorly that I have to redo it. That creates more work for me than if you hadn't done it at all. I need you to take responsibility for learning how to do this properly, or we need to have a direct conversation about why you're refusing to contribute, rather than continuing this pattern where you pretend to try but actually ensure I'll take over. Let's talk about the manipulation of moving goalposts. This is where you do everything the manipulator asks, meet every standard they set, but it's never enough because the target keeps shifting. They're not actually trying to help you succeed. They're ensuring you'll always be failing at something, so they maintain power over you. You work on the issue they said was the problem. Once you've improved, suddenly, that wasn't actually the issue. Something else is. You address their complaint, and they have a new complaint. You meet their standard, and the standard changes. You're perpetually chasing approval that stays just out of reach, no matter how much you change or improve. This manipulation is particularly effective because it keeps you in a constant state of self-improvement effort, while never allowing you to feel like you've arrived. You're always falling short, always needing to be better, always one more change away from the manipulator being satisfied. Except you won't ever get there, because arrival isn't the point. The journey of you perpetually striving is the point. The manipulator benefits from this in multiple ways. Your constant self-improvement focus keeps you from examining whether their demands are reasonable. Your perpetual sense of falling short keeps you grateful for their patience in staying with such a flawed person. Your focus on changing yourself keeps you from noticing that perhaps the problem isn't you at all, it's them. Here's the pattern to recognize. If you've changed substantially and the criticism hasn't decreased, you're dealing with moving goalposts. If addressing one complaint just reveals 3 more complaints, the complaints aren't actually about the specific issues. They're about maintaining a dynamic where you're always wrong and working to be less wrong. The way out is to stop playing. Stop trying to meet standards that are designed to be unmeetable. Stop changing yourself to satisfy someone whose satisfaction is strategically withheld. Start asking whether the problem is your behavior or their unwillingness to be satisfied regardless of your behavior. Now we need to address one of the cruelest manipulations, the bait and switch with your vulnerability. This is where you share something deeply personal, painful, or shameful, and the manipulator initially responds with compassion and understanding, only to later weaponize that information against you when it serves them. In the moment of sharing, they seem safe. They're supportive, empathetic, understanding. They might even share their own vulnerability in return, creating a false sense of mutual trust and intimacy. You feel seen, accepted, loved despite your flaws or past. This feeling of acceptance is profound, which is exactly why the later betrayal is so devastating. Then comes the moment when you're in conflict or they need leverage over you. Suddenly, the thing you shared in confidence becomes ammunition. Well, no wonder you're like this. Given your childhood, you have no room to talk about trust given your past. This is just your trauma response talking. They've taken your vulnerability and converted it into a weapon that keeps you small, ashamed, and compliant. This manipulation doesn't just hurt in the moment. It damages your ability to be vulnerable in the future. If sharing your true self leads to that self being used against you, you learn to keep everything hidden. The manipulator has effectively isolated you not just from other people, but from the possibility of real intimacy with anyone, because you can no longer trust that vulnerability is safe. The prevention: notice how people handle your small vulnerabilities before you share big ones. Do they remember your sensitive topics and avoid weaponizing them when they're upset? Or do they use whatever they know about you as ammunition during conflicts? Someone who uses your disclosed insecurities against you during arguments has shown you that your vulnerability is not safe with them. Believe that evidence. If you're already trapped in this pattern, understand that any vulnerability you share moving forward will become another weapon in their arsenal. This doesn't mean you're the problem for having vulnerabilities. It means they're the problem for exploiting them. The appropriate response is to stop sharing vulnerabilities with someone who's proven they'll weaponize them, regardless of how much they promise they've changed. Let's examine the manipulation of false equivalence in conflicts. This is where the manipulator equates their abusive behavior with your reaction to their abusive behavior, claiming both of you are equally at fault. We both said hurtful things. We're both contributing to the dysfunction. It takes two to tango. They're collapsing the distinction between action and reaction, between abuse and defense, between instigation and response. This manipulation is particularly effective because many people believe in mutual responsibility within relationships. They want to be fair, to acknowledge their own contributions to problems, to not position themselves as blameless victims. The manipulator exploits this healthy instinct towards self-reflection by framing their abuse and your reaction to abuse as equivalent moral failings. But here's the reality. Yelling at someone who's hurting you is not the same as hurting them in the first place. Becoming angry at someone who's manipulating you is not equivalent to the manipulation itself. Your imperfect response to mistreatment is not the same as the mistreatment. The manipulator is trying to scramble cause and effect, turning everything into a vague, "we're both just not good together," when the truth is more specific. They're abusive, and you're responding to abuse. The detection method. Map the sequence of events. Who initiated? Who escalated? Who introduced harm into the interaction? If you're reactive rather than proactive in the conflict, if your behavior is a response to their behavior rather than spontaneous aggression, then you're not equally responsible regardless of what they claim. The counter is to refuse the false equivalence. No, we're not both equally responsible. You did X and I responded with Y. Those aren't the same thing. If you hadn't done X, Y wouldn't have happened. Let's talk about X instead of pretending my reaction to X is the real problem. Now, let's discuss the manipulation of selective attention and memory. The manipulator remembers in vivid detail every mistake you've ever made, every time you fell short, every moment you were less than perfect. But somehow, they can never recall their own problematic behavior. When you bring up something they did, it's ancient history, or you're dwelling on the past, or I don't remember it that way. This creates an asymmetric accountability dynamic. You're perpetually accountable for everything you've ever done wrong, while they're accountable for nothing because they conveniently don't remember their wrongdoings the way you do. Your mistakes are evidence of your character flaws. Their mistakes, if acknowledged at all, are isolated incidents that say nothing about who they are. The manipulation functions as a control mechanism because you know that any mistake you make will be cataloged and potentially brought up in perpetuity. You're hyper-vigilant about your behavior. You're walking on eggshells, constantly monitoring yourself to avoid giving them more ammunition. Meanwhile, they operate with complete freedom because they know their mistakes will be forgotten, minimized, or reframed. What makes this particularly crazy-making is that they'll accuse you of being unforgiving, of holding grudges, of being unable to move on from the past, all while they're the ones maintaining a detailed inventory of your transgressions. The accusation is, as usual, a confession. They're describing their own behavior while claiming it's yours. The solution is to create external accountability. Document patterns. Keep records. When they claim they don't remember doing something harmful, or that you're misremembering how often it happened, you can reference your documentation. This isn't about winning arguments, it's about maintaining your own sanity and sense of reality when someone is trying to erase their behavioral history. Let's explore the manipulation of forced teaming. This is where the manipulator uses language that presumes connection, agreement, or shared experience that doesn't actually exist. They say we when they mean you, creating a false sense of mutual decision-making when they're actually just telling you what to do. We need to work on your trust issues. Actually, you think I have trust issues that need work. We're going to spend the holidays with my family. Actually, you want to spend the holidays with your family, and you're presenting your preference as our mutual decision. We think you're being too sensitive. Actually, you think that, and you're inventing a coalition to make your individual opinion seem like consensus. This forced teaming manipulation serves multiple purposes. It makes the manipulator's unilateral decisions sound collaborative. It makes their individual opinions sound like majority positions. It prevents you from disagreeing without seeming like you're breaking from the team or the relationship. After all, if we decided something, then you disagreeing means you're going against us. The detection is in the language. Notice who says "we" when they're actually talking about their own preferences, beliefs, or decisions. Notice when you're included in a "we" that you never agreed to be part of. Notice when your individual concerns are met with, "That's not how we do things," as if there's an established team policy you're violating. The response is to separate yourself from the forced team. You may think that, but don't use "we" as if I've agreed. I haven't. That might be your plan, but it's not our plan because I wasn't consulted. Don't use "we" to make your opinion sound like consensus. That's your perspective, not our shared perspective. Now we need to address the manipulation of exhaustion. This is where the manipulator wears you down through sheer persistence, repetition, and refusal to accept your no until you're so tired of fighting that you just give in. They've learned that while you won't say yes the first time, you might say yes the 100th time, just to make it stop. They'll ask the same question in different ways. They'll bring up the same request in different contexts. They'll wait a few days and ask again as if you never answered. They'll act hurt that you won't do this one thing, making you defend your boundary over and over until maintaining the boundary feels more exhausting than just violating it. This is psychological attrition warfare. They're not trying to convince you their request is reasonable. They're trying to exhaust your resistance. They know your no is firm, but they're betting that your energy isn't infinite. Eventually, you'll be so worn down by the endless pressure that compliance will seem like the path of least resistance. The cruelty of this manipulation is that it punishes you for having boundaries. Each boundary you set becomes a source of ongoing conflict and pressure, until you learn that having boundaries is more costly than not having them. You're being trained, through exhaustion, to stop protecting yourself. The counter strategy requires recognizing the pattern and naming it. I've answered this question multiple times, and my answer hasn't changed. Asking repeatedly isn't going to change my answer. It's just going to damage our relationship because I'm now dealing with the boundary violation of you not respecting my clearly stated no. Then, and this is critical, stop re-explaining your boundary. Don't provide new reasons or justifications each time they ask. Simply refer back to your previous answer. As I said before, no, don't engage with the question as if it's being asked for the first time. Make it clear you recognize the pattern of them trying to wear you down. Let's talk about the manipulation of making you the reference point for their emotional state. This is where the manipulator positions you as the cause of all their feelings, making you responsible for managing their emotional world. When they're upset, it's because of something you did. When they're happy, it's because you finally got it right. Their emotions become your report card. You make me so angry. You ruined my day. I'm only upset because of you. The language attributes complete causal power to you over their internal state. This serves the manipulator by making their emotions your responsibility to manage. If they're dysregulated, that's your fault and your problem to fix. If they're content, that's conditional on your continued good behavior. This manipulation traps you in an impossible position. You're now responsible for managing another adult's emotional state, which is both inappropriate and actually impossible. No one can control another person's emotions, but the manipulator has convinced you that you can and should, which means when they're upset, you're failing at your job of keeping them regulated. The psychological trap deepens because you start monitoring their emotional state constantly, adjusting your behavior to try to keep them happy, walking on eggshells to avoid triggering their anger or disappointment. You've been assigned a task, manage my emotions, that you can't succeed at because emotions don't work that way. But instead of recognizing the task is impossible, you interpret your inability to keep them constantly happy as evidence of your inadequacy. Here's the truth that breaks this manipulation. Adults are responsible for their own emotions. You can influence someone's emotions through your behavior, but you don't control them. How someone processes, interprets, and responds to their feelings is their responsibility. If someone is consistently blaming you for their emotional state, they're trying to outsource emotional regulation that should be internal work. The boundary to establish. I'm not responsible for your emotions. I'm responsible for my behavior, and I'm willing to discuss my behavior, but I'm not responsible for how you feel about my behavior or about anything else. That's your internal experience, and only you can manage it. We need to examine the manipulation of privacy violation, framed as intimacy. This is where the manipulator demands access to your private spaces, thoughts, communications, and inner world, claiming that real love means no boundaries, no secrets, no privacy. They frame healthy boundaries as suspicious barriers to true intimacy. If you love me, you'll give me your passwords. Real partners don't have secrets. Why do you need privacy unless you're hiding something? They're equating transparency with trust and privacy with betrayal. The message is clear. If you want to prove your love and loyalty, you'll surrender your boundaries around private information. This manipulation works because many people do believe that intimacy requires maximum disclosure. They think that holding anything back means they're not fully in the relationship. The manipulator exploits this by positioning their invasive demands as just wanting closeness, when what they actually want is control through information access. But here's what healthy intimacy actually looks like. Two individuals choosing to share themselves while respecting that each person remains a separate being, with internal experiences they may or may not choose to disclose. Privacy isn't the opposite of intimacy. It's the acknowledgement that intimacy is chosen sharing, not forced extraction. When someone demands total access to your private world, they're not pursuing intimacy. They're pursuing surveillance. They want to monitor you, control you, and catch you in anything they can frame as betrayal. The demand for your passwords isn't about feeling close to you. It's about having the ability to check up on you, to control who you talk to eliminate any space in your life where you're not subject to their oversight. The response is to recognize that privacy is a right, not a privilege you earn through perfect behavior. You're entitled to private thoughts, private communications, private spaces, even in an intimate relationship. Someone who can't tolerate your privacy is someone who can't tolerate your autonomy, which means they don't actually want a relationship with you, they want ownership of you. Now let's address the manipulation of strategic forgiveness, withholding. This is where the manipulator refuses to forgive you for past mistakes, keeping those mistakes perpetually alive and usable as ammunition. You've apologized, changed your behavior, demonstrated growth, but they maintain the right to bring up your past failures whenever it's convenient for them. The manipulation here is that forgiveness is held hostage. It's dangled as something you could earn if you just do enough, change enough, prove yourself enough. But no matter what you do, forgiveness never actually comes, because forgiveness would mean losing leverage. As long as your past mistakes remain unforgiven, the manipulator has permanent ammunition against you. This creates a power dynamic where you're perpetually in debt, perpetually apologizing, perpetually trying to make up for things that happened months or years ago. The manipulator gets to be the perpetual victim, the perpetual injured party, the person who's so incredibly patient for staying with someone as flawed as you. But here's what healthy conflict resolution looks like. You make a mistake, you take responsibility, you apologize, you change the behavior. At that point, the other person either forgives you and moves forward, or they decide the mistake is unforgivable and ends the relationship. What doesn't happen in healthy relationships is the mistake being held in permanent escrow, available to be withdrawn and used against you whenever the manipulator needs to win an argument or deflect from their own behavior. The tell is simple. If you're still being punished for mistakes you've already apologized for and corrected, you're dealing with strategic forgiveness withholding. If your past is brought up during every current conflict, the past isn't the issue, control is the issue. The boundary. I apologized for that. I changed that behavior, and I'm not going to continue being punished for it indefinitely. Either you forgive me and we move forward, or you decide it's unforgivable and we end this relationship. But I'm not available to be in a relationship where my past mistakes are held over me permanently. Let's explore the final and perhaps most damaging manipulation, the destruction of your external validation sources. The manipulator systematically undermines your relationships with anyone who might tell you that the manipulation is happening. They create scenarios where your friends and family see you as the problem, ensuring that if you try to seek help or perspective, you'll be told that you're the issue. This operates through careful narrative control. The manipulator tells others a version of events that positions them as the long-suffering victim of your difficult behavior. They share carefully selected facts that, without context, make you look unreasonable, unstable, or abusive. They might even provoke you into reactions they can then show to others as evidence of your problematic nature. By the time you try to reach out for help, the people you're reaching out to have already been primed with the manipulator's narrative. When you try to explain what's happening, you sound exactly like the manipulator said you would sound: defensive, irrational, blaming. The manipulator has pre-discredited you so effectively that your attempts to get help actually reinforce their narrative. This is devastating because it means you're isolated, not just by the manipulator, but by your own former support system. The people who should be helping you escape are instead telling you to be more understanding of your abuser. You're trapped in a funhouse mirror reality where everyone is seeing a distorted version of what's happening, and you can't make anyone see the truth. The only way out is to accept that you cannot control others' perceptions, especially when those perceptions have been carefully engineered by someone invested in you, appearing to be the problem. You have to be willing to look like the villain in other people's stories in order to save yourself. You have to be willing to lose relationships with people who believe the manipulator's narrative. This is excruciating, but it's necessary. So, where does this leave us? You now understand the mechanics of manipulation in ways most people never will. You can see the patterns, recognize the tactics, understand the psychological principles being exploited. But knowledge alone isn't enough. The final step is integrating this knowledge into your life in a way that protects you without making you paranoid, that keeps you safe without closing you off to genuine connection. Here's the framework for moving forward. Trust your discomfort, that uneasy feeling, that sense that something's off, that cognitive dissonance between what you're being told and what you're experiencing. That's your early warning system. Don't dismiss it. Don't rationalize it away. Don't let someone convince you that your gut instinct is wrong. Your nervous system is picking up on incongruities your conscious mind hasn't processed yet. Document your reality. Keep a journal. Save messages. Create an external record of events, conversations, and your perceptions in real time. This serves multiple purposes. It prevents manipulators from rewriting history. It helps you see patterns you might miss day to day. And it validates your own perceptions when someone is trying to make you doubt them. Maintain relationships outside the relationship in question. Isolation is the manipulator's best friend. Diverse perspectives, external accountability, and people who knew you before this relationship are protective factors. If someone in your life is trying to shrink your social world, that's a red flag, so massive it should be visible from space. Understand that boundaries aren't negotiations. You're not required to justify your limits to anyone. You don't need someone to agree that your boundary is reasonable for your boundary to be valid. If someone consistently violates your boundaries or makes you feel guilty for having them, that person is showing you they don't respect your autonomy. Recognize that leaving is always an option, even when it doesn't feel like it. Manipulators work hard to make you believe you can't leave, that you need them, that you won't survive without them, that you're too invested to walk away now. These are lies designed to trap you. You are always more capable than you've been allowed to believe. Know the difference between healthy influence and manipulation. People in your life will influence you, and that's normal. The difference is consent and transparency. Healthy influence happens when someone openly shares their perspective and you freely choose to consider it. Manipulation happens when someone covertly engineers your choices while making you believe you came to those choices independently. Finally, understand that manipulation thrives in silence and shame. The manipulator's power depends on you not talking about what's happening, not naming the behavior, not seeking outside perspective. The moment you start speaking your reality, even if others don't immediately believe you, you've broken the most important rule of the manipulator's playbook, keeping their tactics invisible. You are not powerless. You are not trapped. You are not crazy for sensing that something is wrong. Your perceptions are valid. Your boundaries are legitimate. Your need for respect, honesty, and autonomy is not negotiable. Anyone who makes you feel otherwise is showing you exactly who they are. Believe them. And more importantly, believe yourself. The manipulation only works when you don't see it. Now you see it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That awareness is your protection, your power, and your path forward. Use it,